begin. We affirm. Framework. The role of the ballot is to vote for the affirmative defense of the plan or the negative defense of the status quo or one unconditional counterplan. The plan. The USFG will remove the PKK from the U.S. State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations immediately by normal means. Any questions? Sorry? One unconditional counterplan. Let's go on to the first advantage, which is Kurdistan. The uniqueness. There's no international recognition of the state of Kurdistan in the status quo. Kurds represent an ethnic minority in the northern part of Iraq and have been de facto independent for a number of years, basically since 2003. The PKK are Kurdish nationalists who believe in the creation of a Kurdish state. The plan gives them legitimacy to create that state. Basically, what happens here is the Kurds are going to, basically what happens here is that there's going to be increased calls for giving the Kurds a state. They already have a de facto state. Basically, what they need is something to push them over the edge to the point where the Iraqi government will realize that they need to have de jure recognition. Iraq will recognize, because the Iraqis currently, there was just a political transition to a more moderate government that is more receptive of ethnic minorities. So basically what happens here is Iraq is going to accept this Kurdish state, first because of U.S. recognition, because of what happens by the plan, and second, because now they have a more moderate government that's more receptive of ethnic minorities. So, the impacts. First is Kurdish relations. They're going to be a stable ally in a very, very unstable part of the world. They will know that the United States was the country that helped them gain their independence more when, they've been trying for 30 years, but the United States was the one who pushed them over the edge. They're going to be basically just another stable ally, and that's going to become important later. Second, that's going to lead to additional negotiating power, and also it's going to lead to regional hard power. So what happens here is, in the war against the Islamic State, Iran is basically fighting with special forces and signal intelligence corps in Iraq, and so what happens here is basically it's part of their overall strategy to exert influence in the rest of the Middle East. They're doing this right now in Yemen, where they're supplying the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and they're also doing this in Iraq. They're trying to exert their hard power in the Middle East. So having another ally that is firmly anti-Iran and pro-United States is going to be basically something that helps us contain the spread of Iran. Basically what happens here is two impacts. We're going to be stopping Iranian territorial ambitions, which basically lowers the risk of war, because every time there are two very opposing powers in the same place, there is a high risk of war. So less Iranian territorial ambitions, that means lower risk of war. The second impact is improved relations with Iraq, because basically what happens here, so the improved Iraq relations basically come from the fact that we are helping them give their states independence. We are basically showing that we care and recognize their what they are doing in Iraq, and that we recognize that what they're doing is a good thing. So what happens here is there's going to be greater cooperation with Iraq on fighting terrorism in general and the Islamic State in particular. Let's go on to the second. Go ahead.
Just a quick point about Iran and Turkey. Are you saying that Iran and Turkey are allies or have good relations with each other?
I have not talked about Turkey at all, so I'm not going to make that judgment. If you'd like to make that judgment one way or the other, feel free. But we're talking about right now the Kurdish state as it exists in Iraq, in northern Iraq, where the Kurds are an ethnic majority, and they have de facto control of that territory. Let's go on to the second advantage, which is the Islamic State. The uniqueness here is that the Kurds are fighting the Islamic State in the status quo because they're fighting to defend against Islamic State attacks and advances against their homeland. The Islamic State, at the beginning of their campaign, took a lot of territory away from the Kurds, and the Kurds are currently fighting with some success to take that territory back. Also, the PKK are fighting ISIS as well. However, the United States is not allowed to help them because they are on the terror list, because they're on the State Department's terror list. So basically what happens here is that there's going to be increase in relations. We're going to actually be able to help them. That's what we need to do here, is basically find allies who can fight our battles if we assist them. So what happens here is there's going to be more Kurdish power, because right now the Kurds are basically fighting with weapons that are left over from the war in Afghanistan and the Iran-Iraq war that were fought 30 years ago. We need to supply them with things that they can use to take on a modern and well-funded army. And so the impact here is that we're going to be halting the Islamic State advance in Kurdish territory. Second, Kurds represent an ethnic minority in various parts of northern and eastern Syria too. So the Kurds are actually interested in driving out the Islamic State in those parts of Syria, because again, the Islamic State are they're basically a terrible group. They have innumerable human rights abuses, and they're selling people into slavery. So the Kurds have a vested interest in getting the Islamic State out of any area where there's a significant ethnic Kurdish presence. So that includes Syria. So not only are we going to be halting the Islamic State's advance in northern Iraq, or the de facto state of Kurdistan, we're also going to be halting ISIS advances in Syria, the parts of Syria where there is a Kurdish ethnic minority. So basically what we're doing here, the impact here is that there's going to be fewer humanitarian abuses, because when the Islamic State is gone, there's going to be, they're not going to be like selling people into slavery. They're not going to be executing them for being Christian or not the right brand of radical Islam. And so like we see that what happens is that the Kurds are a fairly moderate, well, for Middle East standards, they're a fairly moderate regime. They don't execute people for not following a strict and incorrect interpretation of the Quran. They don't commit all of the abuses that the Islamic State do. So it's much better to have areas under Kurd control than it is to have them under Islamic State control. The second impact. The Kurds are uniquely suited to stop the Islamic State's funding. Most of the Islamic State's funding, which is currently we're thinking about $2 million a day, is coming from the illegal trade of oil across the border with Turkey. The way that this happens is that, go ahead.
Just like a quick point. In terms of the U.S. intervention, do you think that would increase the U.S.'s hegemony in this?
Well, that's what we're saying. It's not a U.S. intervention. It is going to be a Kurdish intervention with U.S. backing. And no, I do not think. I think that this is going to increase the. Well, first of all, you can look to our first contention that says it's going to increase U.S. influence, but it's not going to increase U.S. hegemony in terms of hard power. It's just going to increase diplomatic influence, which is what we're going for here. Okay, so the second impact, going back to ISIS, the point about ISIS funding, most of their funding comes from smuggling oil through northern Iraq, or Kurdistan, to Turkey. What they're doing here is that they're using old smuggling routes that happened in the Saddam era of Iraq, where they would be smuggling oil because they had to bypass sanctions. So what's going to happen here is the Kurds are uniquely suited to stop this smuggling because it's their territory in which the smuggling is going on. And so what happens here is that when we fund the Kurds, when we give them the military capability to stop ISIS, we're going to be cutting ISIS off at the root. We're going to be cutting off their sources of funding, which means that they will be incapable to operate. It's going to destroy their operational capabilities, and it's going to lessen their military and power projection presence, which is going to be good for everyone in that territory.
We have 3 off. No, I don't know, just pretty similar length.
Order 3 off or order?
Yeah, then just the 2. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I'm going to do my 3 disadvantages and then their case. Okay. Starting time now. My first disadvantage can be titled Tensions in Turkey. 1. Bilateral tensions between the U.S. and Turkey have grown in the past 5 years. Only Barack Obama's friendship with Prime Minister Erodson, I'm sorry again for the names, is keeping in check according to AEI.org. 2. Barack Obama is leaving office in 2016. This relationship is gone. Status quo is stable but fragile, and any moves to disrupt this peace will be catastrophic backlash. 3. Currently, they trade 3,000 million in goods. They're constantly increasing between these 2 countries. Link, plan passes, internal link. There's 2 link stories. The first, Turkey's angered by the U.S. Declassifying them, this terrorist group, because this is who they've been fighting with for years. And because of politics and trade are inexplicably linked. Yeah.
Did they not negotiate a ceasefire in 2013?
Where
they're not fighting each other anymore?
No, there's always terrorist attacks going on. As we can see, across the world, just with the Ukraine, ceasefires sometimes only last 2 days. Maybe this one lasted a year, but these tensions between these groups and the terrorist fights that's going on are still happening. So these small ceasefires mean literally nothing. The second, and this link is from The Economist, my first internal link. The second internal link is a perceptual one. People in Turkey, they see this as a deceitful and aggressive move. People will see their family killed, and there have been 18,000 civilians killed by these terrorist groups. They see this as now the U.S. is no longer supporting them. The impact. U.S. and Turkey trade decreases, which hurts those in Turkey and the U.S., and the goods are more expensive. Also, the hatred towards the U.S. We lose this relationship we have with another country, which is beneficial to citizens of both countries. Yes, basically, also in Turkey and in the United States, there's a lot of people in poverty, especially they have a totally different poverty line in Turkey. There's a lot more poor people. So they need these connections because I'm sorry, I already took a POI. As one of the world's fastest growing countries, to have an ally like this is really important, and we show how they hurt it. My second disadvantage is called it hampers future attacks. 1, in the status quo, funding is limited to these groups. 2, resources aren't readily available because of this list. And this list that the U.S. State Department has actually has legal ramifications. 3, look to how the move to money equals more weapons, and that's the deficit that the KPP has. They don't have these weapons. They have something like 4,500 arms. So the link this plan passes. The first internal link. It is now lawful to provide material support and resources to this group because they're no longer on the state list. Second, U.S. financial institutions no longer have to report funds to the U.S. Treasury and then hand them over from these organizations. 3, there's more support because less U.S. backlash, which historically is a very powerful and dissuasion tactic. So that's kind of a perceptual link. Impacts. First is more weapons and fighting means more death. 2, there's continued instability in the region. And 3, a fear of terror is a less productive and less quality of life for everyone around. I'm sorry, I have a lot of arguments to get through. 3, this masks the issue, and I'm going to use this later as a turn, so this argument's really important. This is the third disadvantage. The first, the PKK and the I'm just going to refer to them as the PKK, but we're both talking about these groups, has been fighting ISIS, and many dead and outgunned. They have not been winning these battles. ISIS is just too powerful. 2, ISIS is spread across the Middle East, and now they're into Africa. This is no longer a fight that the PKK can win. Link, plan passes. Internal link. There's 2 link stories. First, the PKK is seen as if they will the ones to defeat ISIS, because now the U.S. is perceptually backing them. They take them off the list. Now it's your guys' turn to defeat ISIS. And they're basically seen like they're being rewarded. 2, this erases the history and wrongdoing and gives a new slate, even though this has been mass dead. So they've killed 7,000 Turkish soldiers, 3 million civilians have been displaced by them, and 18,000 citizens have been killed by them. 3, this makes it seem like they will defeat ISIS because of the U.S. backing, and it washes the hands of the problem. According to their own rhetoric, that's what's going on, look to their whole second advantage. So the impact is there's less justice, so there is more future disdain between these groups, because this classification, it's what's being okay, yes, they did all these wrong things, but at least they're considered a terrorist group. Imagine if the people that killed your family are no longer a terrorist group. Of course there's going to be worse relations between these people, and this will also function as a turn later. Also, ISIS is not solved as quickly because of this masking problem, so any impacts they have about ISIS is even worse with their plan. Okay, responses. On the start, they say an ethnic, so they start the first advantage about the minority and how they'll have this new state. Judge, my first response is dissolving this terrorist organization is not the same as creating a state. They will not get their state anyway, and if they do, they have to prove the link story, because actually there's just going to be more disdain, and the Turkish government will not like this. Of course, government, even outside of Turkey, like Iraq. So this is also going to turn it because you prolong the time it takes for them to get a state. Also, because of the masking issue. Also, they said we'll have a new stable ally. I have 3 responses. My first, Turkey and Iraq have more net benefits because of power. We don't need this ally. It's better to have them as allies. 2, do we need more allies in the Middle East? Judges, we have no deficit of allies in the uniquenesses. 3, why do you think there will be a stable ally? This new country, which has a lot of history of terrorism and which is really going to have bad relations with their neighbors, why do you think that this will be a stable ally? On the thing that contains Iran's trade grabs, 1, there's no uniquenesses in the status quo that this is the one thing that can solve Iran's trade grabs. Furthermore, they never say why Iran's trade grabs are bad or that there's a lot of them going on. For all we know in this round, because they never proved us, Iran has taken 1 square mile of land that no one was using. They never proved us why this is a bad thing. Also, we turn this. In their world, they're controlling Kurds that would get other countries on their side. This increases the influence, which means there's less chance of an Iran deal because of this U.S. power. They said the U.S. gets increased influence. But this is a bad thing because in the U.S.-Iran negotiations, anytime the U.S. gets more influence in this region, so does Saudi Arabia because they're allies. And Iran, in these nuclear talks, has specifically said, we don't want to do this because Saudi Arabia could get a nuclear program. We need to be able to defend ourselves. And this is exactly what's happening. Iran does not want more U.S. influence in the Middle East if they will ever sign these nuclear agreements. Okay, also on their impacts, we have a couple things. So I already talked about how their impact, Judge, all their impacts have nothing to do with their uniquenesses. Their impacts are on the Iran land grabs, but is that even a problem? They don't bring it up in their uniquenesses. Their uniquenesses are all about minority, how it's a minority and how they'll get a state. They don't actually connect them at all. Also, they say, we care, you have this is bad because you guys have an increased cooperation between the wrong people, how I already showed, and a decreased cooperation between the people that need it, the Kurds and the Kurds. 2, their ISIS argument. They say Kurds are fighting ISIS. Very limited. As I said, they've been losing a lot of battles. Just look over the news. They said all these Kurds got killed. They say the U.S. can't help. We're helping in the status quo in other ways. It's not the only way that the U.S. can help solve ISIS is with this. Also, here's an inherency press. ISIS is falling apart in the status quo. Look to the fact that their leaderships are fighting among each other. Their 3 main leaders have all been killed in the past year. Plus, according to both Theodore Elliott, the former U.S. ambassador, ambassador to Afghanistan, and The Guardian, Iraq is the only body that can actually solve ISIS for good. Furthermore, according to MSNBC and the UK Independent, ISIS will fall apart by its own. So either way, you're just not performing their plan. Also, you don't solve ISIS, you prolong them because of DA3, and you have no fiat on US funding, and they wouldn't do it anyway. Like, the US would never fund them because of the backlash. So thank you.
Okay, 3 off, half case, on case, in the same order. So it'll be tensions in Turkey, more attacks, and ISIS. Everyone ready? All right, I'm going to begin now. So first, our opponents brought up 3 contentions, the first of which is tensions in Turkey, disadvantage 1. So our opponents talked about how tensions will get worse if we remove the PKK from the State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations. The problem is these tensions aren't going to change anyways. We already have, like our opponent stated, a very fragile relationship. The problem is our relationship with Turkey is already bad. Turkey has they have a very porous border. They've already allowed ISIS fighters to repeatedly cross the border in and out to basically continue their attacks against both the Kurds and against their opposition to the Yazidis. So the problem is our relationship with Turkey is already pretty bad, and it's not like if we de-terrorize this Kurdish group that we're going to go over some sort of brink. So the negation needs to prove that we're at some sort of brink at which relationships between us and Turkey will totally fall apart. And this isn't going to happen. Now, opponents talk about how this is basically going to anger Turkey. The problem is all this anger is now being directed against ISIS. ISIS is the biggest enemy. Back then it was PKK vs Turkey. Now it is PKK and Turkey vs IS. The problem what our opponents don't understand is that the Islamic State is so much of a bigger threat. They constantly decapitate people. They sell people into slavery. This is stuff that the PKK doesn't do. And all the extremist actions that the PKK has done was in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now our opponents talk about how this is basically cleaning out a blank slate, like this isn't justice. So just because they aren't doing this right now doesn't mean they should still be held accountable. The problem is the world is constantly changing. The world is dynamic, and just because it's just like how we don't begrudge the South for seceding from the Union. This is something that we need to constantly change our relationships and not get into tangling in alliances just because this group was against us so many decades ago. Yes.
Super quick, just where are you on the flow? Because that argument was in our third disadvantage.
All right. Yeah, I tie that to tensions, but yeah, I'll go over that again if necessary. Yeah. Okay. So moving on to the second disadvantage about more attacks. We're going to turn this. Basically, more arms, more fighting equals good, because now they're not fighting with Turkey. They've already signed a ceasefire. There is absolutely no fighting between the PKK and the Turkish government. That was in the 80s and the 90s. We are in the 21st century now, and the 21st century means that this group is going to be fighting ISIS. And the more arms we supply, the more fight that goes against ISIS, the bigger fight that we can put up against ISIS is better, because as we all know, ISIS is an extremist organization that we definitely need to take care of. Okay, so turn that. Third disadvantage about ISIS. Basically, our opponents are talking about, we can't win, and how we're creating a new slate. We're wiping the history. We're ignoring all the deaths that have been caused by the PKK. The problem is, once again, we need to change our stance as time moves on. It's not like we need to be regressive and just sit back, and just because it was like this 50 years ago, we're going to be like that 50 years later. The problem is, ISIS is even worse. It is even worse than what the PKK can possibly do. As we can see, they've controlled vast swaths of Syria and Iraq, and they're constantly committing human rights abuses that no one disagrees with. The problem is, right now, basically, the PKK is unable to completely win over because they are using obsolete technology that are basically hand-me-downs from Cold War era fights. And so, if we supply them with United States arms, they will be able to better carry out their fight. And this is good because this way we won't have to set our boots into the ground, which would cause all sorts of actual issues with Iraq, Syria, Iran, and our allies in the Middle East. So instead of setting hard boots onto the ground, we're going to be supporting them with arms, with what we're doing right now. And the plan solves for this by increasing that, and increasing the rate at which ISIS will fall. Okay, going over the AF case. Basically, in refutation to our first advantage, our opponents talked about how they won't. This state isn't going to be created because the Turkish government won't allow it. The problem is this isn't what's up to the Turkish government to decide. This is what's up for this organization to decide. This is what the PKK decides to do. If once they get pushed over this brink when the U.S. increases their legitimacy by reducing them from the terrorist organizations list, then they will have the legitimacy to go create a new state. And like I've already stated, included, Iraq is going to allow this because they have more moderates in the government now. It's not like it's like an extreme conservative government that will not allow ethnic minorities to enter that place. Besides, the region in which the PKK wants Kurdistan to exist is already ethnically like a majority is Kurdish. So therefore, it's not really like up to the Turkish government to decide what goes on in Iraq, for example. Okay, finally, our opponents talked about how this is going to cause problems with all of our allies, such as Turkey, and how we have too many allies in the Middle East. The problem is we have so many enemies. We have so many more enemies in the Middle East than we do have allies. And the problem is it's always better to have more allies, especially once we get these new allies, it's not like Turkey is going to totally cut off trade with us because they have interest in joining the EU and continuing their good relationship with NATO. And who controls who basically controls NATO? It's the United States. So obviously they don't want to get United States angst. And also they want to enter the European Union, so they're not going to give the cold shoulder to all these other countries just because the Kurds are now fighting against the common enemy that Turkey doesn't want in its territory anyways. So we can see that there's a new common enemy. So Turkey and the PKK doesn't really want to go against each other anymore, especially considering that they've already signed a ceasefire. And all this violent past that our opponent is trying to vilify the PKK with was all basically like literally in the last century. It was in the 1980s, the 1990s. They're not as extreme as they are now, and it's not like they have some sort of religious ideology, like some jihad ideology that fuels their destruction and fight. It's the ideology that they want to create a state for themselves in the place where they have the ethnic majority. And also, our opponents talked about how this reduces our chance for how like Iran is expanding and all this stuff, and it'll reduce our chances for an Iran deal. The problem is, yes, the problem is Iran is expanding territorially. They are expanding. They are basically fueling the Houthis, which is causing this crisis in Yemen. So obviously it is in both the United States' interest, the Kurds' interest, and the Iraqi and the Yemen interest to basically increase the pressure on Iran. We are trying to back Iran into a corner. This isn't going to reduce the chance of Iran deal. It's going to increase the chance, because if Iran does not cooperate, then basically they're going to back themselves even further into a diplomatic corner. Okay, so in terms of IRIS, our opponent constantly talks about how the Kurds aren't fully capable, and yes, that is the problem, and that is what the plan is going to solve. The Kurds are using very obsolete technology to fight against a very modern extremist terrorist organization that gets $2 million a day from illegal oil funding, and this is what the plan is going to solve. We're going to give them modern United States weapons, modern missile systems, and other vehicles that will be able to solve this ISIS problem even faster. Our opponent talked about how some random analyst in NBC or whatever said, okay, ISIS is failing. The problem is they control an area where 8 million people are there. They control vast swaths of Syria and Iraq, both places of which the Kurds have a presence in which they have ground fighters in, so ground troops in. So basically what this is going, with U.S. aid, we don't necessarily need to fully commit ourselves into like sending ground troops in there, but we will be able to solve this problem by providing them aid, and we'll be able to even faster push ISIS over the brink and destroy them. Thank you.
So I'm going to be going off-case and on-case. Starting time now. Just want to thank everyone for coming on, opponents, partners, and with that I'm going to get right into it. So first of all, looking over to the tensions in Turkey. So first of all, their main response that they give is that tensions aren't going to change because tensions are already so bad. Yet, Judge, I really want you to think about the warrants that we have for like what the current situation is. They just say, think about it, Judge, tensions are already so bad. But I beg you to look to our uniquenesses where we say in the past 5 years, tensions have been increasing, but they are stable because of Barack Obama's friendship. They completely ignore our analysis about how, in fact, this relation in the status quo is stable but fragile, and so, in fact, things will change if this plan is implemented. They just give, they basically give, like, these, like, opinions about, like, the certain current situation, but you have to value our analysis of what this current situation is to actually, like, consider, like, in this debate, yeah, like we have the warrants that like say this is what the situation is, yeah.
So if the president is the only reason that tensions are good right now, doesn't that mean that our relations will totally fall apart in January 2017, no matter what happens?
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting point. And that's when we talking, like in our analysis we said that like right now, because like Barack Obama does have this friendship, they are constantly working on like improving their relationship. And so like this is the only reason that we are going to ever be able to increase our relationships, our diplomatic situation. And so that is like how in the future like Turkey will be increased. So to say like they are like the relationship is completely in shambles is just simply not true.
That's the brink scenario.
Yeah, and like that is exactly our brink scenario, where like in their world, if we pass this, then all shots of any negotiation are off. But right now, we are able to actually like increase our influence in Turkey. Also, they basically say like they also say that like Turkey is also mad at ISIS, so they're going to be completely fine with this. At the point where they completely ignore our perceptual link, this point holds no weight. You can be mad at both groups. There is not like a zero-sum game, and at the point where they ignore the analysis that people in Turkey are going to see this as a deceitful and aggressive move, and people are going to like see that their families have been killed, like the people that have been killing their families are all of a sudden not considered a terrorist organization. Of course, they're not going to say like, well, I'm going to just fight ISIS now. They are still going to be angry at the Kurds, and they never respond to this fact. They just say like, Turkey's just going to want to fight ISIS. No, look to the unrefuted point about how we say that these people will still want to fight against the PKK. This will still exist. They also say that Turkey doesn't care about the PKK anymore because in the 1980s and 1990s. First of all, deaths are happening all the time, and also 20 years isn't like a very long time to consider. And as I looked, and if you look to my analysis again, in my uniqueness, tensions have been rising. In the past 5 years. So like this is like an actual war. When they just say like, think about it, Judge. Like things are so much better. You actually have to like look at the analysis that we bring from ABI.org that like says that like tensions are actually rising in Turkey as a result. Also, so like you can flow across our perceptual link, and also you can flow across all of our economic arguments because these go unresponded to, Judge. So please consider that. Now on to our second point, which basically their main response is like they say like turn more arms equals more fighting. I have a few responses to this. First of all, more arms in very volatile regions is very bad. Look to the U.S. funding Mujahideen later, and that the U.S. later used against the U.S. You can see that like they are making huge assumptions. Also, two, they also do not solve for this. I really want to make this clear. Their whole case, judges, relies on all of a sudden the PKK is going to get all of these arms, but they never get access to that. Look to what they actually get in terms of fiat. Fiat is an act of imagination where you actually get to pass one thing. In this instance, their plan is that the PKK is no longer recognized as a terrorist organization. Never in their plan text is that now the U.S. is sending over all of this money so that the PKK can fight off all these people. And at the point where they're getting all their benefits from this like extra topical element of their plan, you cannot grant them those benefits because all they can get access to is the idea that the PKK will no longer be considered a terrorist organization, and that is it. Do not let them be granted the idea that they're going to all of a sudden be so much stronger and be able to fight against that. Like, yeah, it's because like the resolution doesn't give that ability. Also, they also say that we need to take care of ISIS. This is the turn on their rhetoric. Oh yeah. So basically, like this is their turn on the rhetoric. Look to our disadvantage 3 about how like they say it like exactly like this is a massive problem. Like we have analysis saying that this state alone is not enough to actually do this. And the main thing that is actually going to actually have effect, according to Theodore Elliott and MSNBC, they say that like these two countries, Syria and Iraq, are like the ones that are pivotal in actually changing this, not this small PKK group. This goes unresponded to, Judge. They're trying to like blow this out of proportion by saying like the PKK is the answer. If they do this, then we will solve all of ISIS. Do not give them that impact because they never actually like give you any like links for why. First of all, why the PKK would ever get funded by the United States. They would never do that. They would never put all these arms into such a volatile region. Also, they can't assume that. And even more than that, they cannot assume that those benefits will come because they don't actually have any warrants saying that if the PKK gets a certain amount of funds, then all of a sudden they will be very well off. On to the third point, they basically say the same thing. So you can they say the same thing about how we need more arms to defeat. You can't feel that U.S. supports this aid, and also U.S. has their own mission to do this. This goes unresponded to. The U.S. is already taking movement. Also, you can extend all the analysis about how in the status quo, ISIS is already getting weaker and weaker. They never responded to the fact that that the top 3 leaders in ISIS have already been killed in the past year. They also never responded to the fact that more and more funding and more people are actually fighting against ISIS. So the PKK is not going to be the one thing to tip it over the edge. That is just simply not going to happen. Now onto their case. So basically say they have to have in terms of how the PKK is going to get their state. They basically say they're going to have legitimacy. And they need legitimacy to actually ever get a state. They haven't ever actually shown that this is going to be the brink that makes them get this legitimacy. They never have any warrant saying that this is specifically going to make them get the state. And at the point where they never actually address our analysis about how this is in fact a masking problem, and that now people are not going to actually recognize that there is still a fight to get a state, where people are just very passive, they will never get a state in this instance. And because we have that analysis, and they just have this very bland this very underworked analysis, you cannot buy that example. Also, they also say there's so many enemies and there's so many enemies in the Middle East. You cannot buy that point because of the fact that we do have a lot of allies in the region, and you can cross-apply all my analysis on my first contention to the second point of ISIS. Thank you.
So on my speech, I'm going to quickly go over the negations case, the affirmations case, and I have 5 other issues. Okay, starting time now. So just finally things, thank you all for coming out today. I really want to crystallize it and show you, the negation is winning on so many fronts here, so I really want to, in this speech, answer key questions that quickly wins us the round, because just which world is better after the plan passes, why we're here. Okay, so on to the first argument about tensions in Turkey. Judges, today you should be flowing across all our perceptual arguments on this first one. We have 2 link stories. I said it very clearly. We have 2 link stories. We have the one about how people in Turkey just think this. Their only response, in which they make time and time again, almost their whole speeches, this was 20 years ago, this is 20 years ago. That's not really a response that counters our whole link story. That's just their opinion. At the point in which you have families dying, less than 5 years ago, family members dying in Turkey, and they say, oh, this was all 20 years ago, this is a really bad thing to just try to brush it under the rug and never address it. And also, this isn't even a good response because this only attacks a very small part of this argument. Furthermore, all economics arguments flows through. The Barack Obama leaving in 2 years, that was our bring story. We're saying we need to keep Turkey relations good because the man who makes it so our relations are good is about to leave. We can't have 2 horrible things happen in a row. That's our bring story. And judges, I'd like to point out, this is one of the only bring stories in this whole round. We really have no uniquenesses from their side. On the second argument, judges, their turn, we turn it right back. They're just trying to put more arms into this region. And judges, even furthermore, they're relying on this post-fiat thing. They never prove it happens and they can't get any impacts off it. So anytime you hear in this round, oh, but the Kurds get more weapons, and that's a bad thing, as we said earlier, but then if they go on to say they get more weapons so they can solve ISIS, that's where they get into the masking term. And the masking argument is my final one, and I'm not going to go over it again because my partner did a great job, but don't let them get away with all these extra topical impacts. On their case, first of all, there is no bring scenario. They don't respond to our turns. They try to say that they try to respond to the Iran thing, but when in their own speech, they says this would increase U.S. influence, and we have a turn that says U.S. influence bad in the region because Iran never gets its nuclear deal, and it's horrible for the people of Iran because they don't get these sanctions relief. That's an impact you can be weighing on, and that happens very early because it is a turn. Also, we say, you guys make it so they'll never be able to get their own state. And once again, they try to bring up, oh, they have legitimacy now. They don't have legitimacy. It will look like this really poorly done move by the United States. Finally, just go on the second argument on ISIS, we have so many responses to this. Their only response is, oh, some random guy from MSNBC, and I'll be talking about why that doesn't help this dialogue at all, just accuse foreign ambassadors that they don't know what they're doing in my voters. My first voters of uniqueness. There are no deficits or bring scenarios in the affirmations case at all. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. Right now in the status quo, ISIS is falling, but they're also expanding. They're spread pretty thin. Like, the second one, they're not just in this region. They can't defeat ISIS. Furthermore, they've lost all their battles with ISIS. Like, there's no reason why they need this. And anytime they say, oh, well, once they have, don't let them say, oh, once they have U.S. weapons, it will work. If you actually believe that, you need to make them prove it. Like we said, U.S. already has their own operations. They don't want to fund this because last time we funded this, the Mujahideen, it ended up being used against American soldiers. This is not going to happen in MK. So basically, they have no link from, they have no link from their uniquenesses to their impacts. I pointed it out in my first speech. I said their uniquenesses are all about the state. Their impacts are all about Iran land grabs. We don't know if that's a big deal at all. So you can't vote for them on these impacts because they don't matter. My second voting issue of U.S. support fiat is not allowed, and they don't get any of these impacts. Ned promises that the U.S. proves that the U.S. wouldn't support, so don't just go against them, because all their link stories, they never say, they try to skip over it. What's the link story? Where's the proof that the U.S. does send weapons? And what's the proof that the reason that the Kurds aren't winning is because of a weapons deficit? Their third response, wow, this was so long ago, and they say Turkey has a common enemy now, they'll work together. Like, once again, make them prove that. It's not like Turkey can only hate one terrorist group at a time. Like, that's not a historical thing at all. It's not a zero-sum game in the amount of hate they can dish out to terrorist groups. Fourth is the masking DA. Conceding that the PKK gets even more hate after the plan makes it so they can never become a state. Because of this, now there's no justice. They can see that. That's the one masking. You mask the problem, and now it actually hurts. That's the first impact off the masking, because they never get the state. The second impact off masking, you lose, because they're losing in the status quo, and they have no link to U.S. support, they mask the ISIS problem, and ISIS can kill even more and more people. Finally, impact weighing. In the region, after the plan, you get more death, and you get more fighting because of this. Second, to the world, you hurt relations with Turkey and U.S. relations. And three, you hurt the Kurds because they decrease the chance of ever getting a state. They just want to make the region an even more vital place, and because of that, I believe the plan should be voted down. Thank you.
Off case, quickly, and then voters. All right. Everyone ready? Starting with our first disadvantage, don't buy the uniqueness story. They said really that Obama is the only reason the Turkey...
Point of order, all the analysis about our uniqueness was never talked about until last speech. Like, I watched part of it, was like they never respond to our uniqueness, and then just like making big claims, and like now he's talking about attacking our uniqueness.
He hasn't even made an argument.
I haven't made an argument yet.
Literally just said, like, on the uniqueness, so I don't even know what argument's making.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, basically extend everything my partner said about how their relations are already bad in the status quo. Second, they never really gave you a terminal impact besides economy, but then you can see a little bit later when I'll explain how that's totally outweighed by everything that happens with the Islamic State. Second, extend what my partner said about how the Islamic State is the bigger threat. Countries will work in their best interest. They will, be willing to forget what has happened, in order to work together and basically go against a bigger threat. The problem here is that the Islamic State, there's no reason that they can't be mad at both, but the Islamic State is a much, much bigger threat than the PKK. The problem here is that, the fact that the PKK will be fighting the Islamic State and have been fighting the Islamic State is something that Turkey will weigh much more highly, because Turkey views the Islamic State as a threat as well. Extend everything that I talked about in the 1AC about Turkey, about the Islamic State's military capabilities and power and everything they've been doing to make land grabs in the region. Turkey sees that as much more of a threat than some small group. However,
point of order, the analysis that Turkey sees ISIS as much more of a threat than the PKK was never
came directly out of the 2AC.
Because the analysis that he brought up.
So, yeah, you're saying I'm sure it's under consideration.
On to their second disadvantage. Okay, so let's talk about this issue of fiat. They say that we don't get to fiat that the United States is going to be supplying them with arms. That's fine. First is an argument that came out of the bloc, and so I will respond to it now. The United States historically sends arms to people who will help them fight their enemies, especially the Islamic State. What they said about the Mujahideen actually supports us. We don't have to fiat this because we know it's going to happen. It's been happening with ISIS. We've been supporting Iraq in their fight against ISIS. We've been supporting the Free Syrian Army, which is a rebel group similar to the PKK, in their fight against ISIS. There's no reason to think that this won't happen with the PKK, especially because the PKK are fighting ISIS right now, so the United States will help them because that is what the United States does when these situations come up. Third disadvantage. The ISIS impact is linear. They're saying that the KPP is not enough to hurt. They're saying that KPP is not enough to hurt, but the ISIS impact is linear. So basically, if there's a risk that the KPP is going to degrade the Islamic State's capabilities, that's going to flow. That's going to flow over. They say we need to prove a brink, but however, we don't need to say that the Islamic State is going to be totally dissolved by the KPP. And in fact, we're not trying to claim that because the KPP only cares about areas in which there are Kurd ethnic minorities. However, this ISIS impact is linear. So the more that we can degrade the Islamic State's capabilities, the stronger this impact goes over to the affirmative. So the plan accelerates and ensures that, and so the plan basically accelerates and ensures that the PKK are going to have this capability. Going on to the voters. First is funding. They dropped our entire they dropped our entire impact story in the second advantage about how the Islamic State needs funds and that the KPP is uniquely suited to cut off the Islamic State's funding sources. This is where the uniqueness story comes from, is that the KPP is the only actor in the region that is capable of cutting off the Islamic State's funding sources. And the Islamic State's funding sources, as I said in my 1AC, are that is the part where, that is where they get all of their capability to project power in the region and do all of these bad things that they're doing. So the problem here for them is that, like, the KPP is a unique actor in that they are the only ones who are capable of combating the Islamic State's funding sources. If we can cut off the head of the snake, it won't matter about the rest of it, because if we cut off all of their funding sources, then there's nothing that they can do. So what we see here is that the KPP is the only actor. They never responded to that. So what we see is that when we fund the KPP and when we give them the ability to fight, they're going to fight against the Islamic State because they already are. This is linear. The more we help them, the more they fight. And then the more there is a risk that we are going to be cutting off their funding sources. And basically this plan is try or die. The Islamic State is going to continue expanding, and even if they say there's a decline, extend what my partner said about how the Islamic State is massive now, so the decline is going to take a long time, even if it does happen. Like, they only said that some people said it's going to happen. They never actually gave you any warrants as to why it would happen. But the other thing here is that, the Islamic State, again, is massive. So anything we can do to stop the decline is extremely important, which leads us to the impact analysis. The Islamic State is terribly bad. It does slavery, and there's prostitution, and they kill people for not agreeing with them. This is an extremely important impact. This outweighs anything that they might win about Turkish economic relations, because the Islamic State is a common enemy to the entire region. So what happens here is that that's going to outweigh. So the impact is linear here. The Kurdish People's Party, the KPP are the only people who can actually cut ISIS off at the head. That is our uniqueness story. And so if we have a risk of doing that, you have to vote affirmative, because that outweighs anything that they could possibly say. It outweighs anything they could possibly say about how relations with Iraq might worsen, because the Islamic State is the worst actor in the region. They are killing people's families, as the opponent said. They are doing all of these bad things. They're making territorial land grabs. They're putting the entire country, or they're putting the entire region into turmoil. And so stopping ISIS should be weighed most importantly in this round, and the only team that actually gives you that possibility is the affirmative. You have to vote here on the risk of offense, because the opponents do absolutely nothing to stop one of the most destructive forces in the Middle East today. Thus we affirm.